Of course, people can show grace one to another, but in a biblical sense, grace is from God. It emanates from God. It comes from God. And God expresses his grace to us in various ways. So that is my definition of grace. A gift of favor from God to man. What is works? What is works? And there can be many definitions, but this is my definition, Mensa Otabil's definition. When I say works, it means an effort of man or woman to obtain something. An effort of a man or woman or a person to obtain something. So when I make an effort to obtain something, it is works or work. It has a very wide application from our salvation to our daily living. So, although God works, in my definition of works, I'm looking at man working, not God working. So, I'm limiting it to man. Now, when you read your New Testament, and how many of you read the New Testament? If you are in CCC, you are a Bible student. This is one of the most well-taught churches you can find anywhere in the world. That is why I can take my time to teach. Because in some churches, you take your time to teach, the people will sleep. Because they are not used to teaching. They're used to exhortation and encouragement. But here, people are used to teaching, so I'm taking my time to teach, and I have to lay my foundations right. Now, when you read your New Testament, you will find that Paul, the apostle, uses grace and works. And he uses works very much. And when you read Paul's epistles, you get the impression that works are not very important. When you read Paul, you get the impression that works are not as important as grace. But then when you read the epistle of the apostle James, then you get the other impression as if works is more important than grace. Have you noticed that? So why is that in the New Testament, one speaks as if works is not important, and then another side, it looks like works is important? And the reason is very simple. The apostle Paul uses works in a different context from the apostle James. So what Paul means by works is not what James means by works. When Paul says works, he's talking about the works of the law, the requirements of the law of Moses that was demanded by God for them to worship him. So when Paul says, by the works of the law shall no one be justified, that's what he means. When he says we are saved by grace and not by works, that is what he means. The works he means is not you working, like going to work or farming. That's not what he means. He doesn't say when you farm you cannot be saved. When he says works, he means specifically the laws of Moses. Are you following me? Because if you don't have that understanding, you will misinterpret what works means. When James says works, he doesn't mean the law of Moses. When James says works, he means what you do, the works you produce because of your salvation. So when a person becomes born again, Paul himself says they have been born again unto good works. So being born again means that you are going to do something. What you do because you are born again is what James calls works. So he says, show me your works and I will show you your faith. Why? Because what you produce because of your salvation reflects on your salvation. Paul also says, you cannot just get salvation by your own works. It is a work of grace. They are using the same word, but they have two different meanings in mind. It's so important, because if you don't get that, you will confuse yourself when you read the Bible. All right? So let me get that out of the way. Now, if we say that a person's success in life, or what we achieve in life, is purely a result of what God has done. So if, for example, you see that Pastor Ransford is in ministry and Pastor Ransford has done well, and you say, well, it's grace. It's grace. Then it means that everything we see here in CCC is purely done by God. All right, it means that God built this building and arranged these flowers and put this microphone in my hand. All right? So, because sometimes, you know, people say, oh, Pastor Ransford, you've done well. Somebody say, hey, don't say he's done well. It's all grace. Because once we say something is grace, it means no effort was put into it. It is purely a work of God. But we know that that is not the absolute truth. All right. Now, if we also say it is not grace, it is works, Pastor Ransford worked, then it means that God didn't play any role in it. This is just the work of man. So there is a confusion. Is it grace? Is it works? How do we draw the balance? When we see somebody successful, do we say this is the grace of God, or do we say this is the work of man? Is it of grace or of works? And many times Christians are not able to answer this question, and as a result we are not able to determine how to achieve the things we have to achieve, because some are waiting for God's grace and some are working as if there is no grace. So how do we resolve this conundrum? Once in a while you have to throw in a big word for people to know that although you are simply dressed, you are so we say things like conundrum. All right, so that is the issue I'm trying to resolve, and just be patient with me. By the time I'm through, you would know how to balance yourself properly between grace and works. All right, now 1 Corinthians chapter 4 verse 7. 1 Corinthians chapter 4 verse 7. It says, for who makes you differ from another? And what do you have that you did not receive? Now if you did indeed receive it, why do you boast as if you had not received it? It's a very interesting scripture, you know, and sometimes people throw it out there. What do you have that you didn't receive? If somebody is being honored for success, we say that. But there are three concepts that emerge from this passage. The first one is that we differ from one another because of what we have received from God. God's gifting to us, God's gifting to me, God gives into you, God gives into Pastor Ransford, is what makes us different and unique. So when we say that every human being is different and unique, it's not because your face is different. It's because God has gifted you differently from the other person. God's gift is what makes us differ. Our difference is our gifting. Our difference is our gifting. And our gifting is from God. So we differ from one another because of what we have received from God. God's gifts makes us different or unique. Second, all that we have in life comes from what we have received from God. All that we have in life comes from what we have received from God. So every achievement or height we get to in life is based on what we have received from God. Even when we work hard for something, we must still see it as coming from God as Christians. So everything we have comes from God. Third, we cannot boast of what we have as if we didn't receive it from God. We cannot boast of what we have as if we didn't receive it from God. That's what 1 Corinthians chapter 4 verse 7 is telling us. God owns all that we have. Now, if that is so, can we say that someone is more successful than the other person? Can we measure success? Can we measure achievement? Can we look at somebody and say, this person has done well, or that person has done better? Should we do that at all? Should Christians look at one another and say, this one has done better than him, and because of that, we will reward this one and not that one? Should we do that? Because if everything we have achieved is from God, can we even judge people's success? Now, to answer that question, I want to go to Proverbs chapter 31 verse 10. Proverbs 31, as you know, talks about a virtuous wife. And verse 10 says, who can find a virtuous wife? For her worth is far above rubies. Interesting. Who can find a virtuous wife? How many of you have found a virtuous wife? I see some husbands whose hands are down. You found it, but it wasn't. Okay. Who can find a virtuous wife? Now, that question means a virtuous wife is not an accidental find. You don't find a virtuous wife accidentally. And I can say you don't find a virtuous husband accidentally also. The question who can find means that it is rare. It is rare. It's not something that is easy to find. Some find it, others don't find it. All right. Then, when you look at verse 29 of Proverbs 31, it still talks about a virtuous woman. It says, many daughters have done well, but you excel them all. So this woman is being compared with other women. Why is she rare? Because in comparison with others, she goes above. All right. So it is clear that there are people who are more successful than other people. So when you look at the virtuous wife, for example, can you just say it's grace? Because if it is grace, everybody will be virtuous. Is that not so? If it is grace, every wife will be a virtuous wife. So this woman has something else that has made her a virtuous wife. And when you read through the whole of Proverbs chapter 31, from verse 13, it says, she seeks wool and flax and willingly works with her hands. Verse 14, she's like the merchant ship, she brings her food from afar. 15, she rises while it is yet night, provides food for her household. Verse 16, she considers a field and buys it. From her profits she plants a vineyard. 17, she girds herself with strength. 18. She perceives that her merchandise is good and her lamp does not go out by night. Now, if you look at the reason why she's virtuous, it's not grace. Did you see that? It is something she's doing. It's works. She seeks wool, willingly works with her hands, brings food from afar, rises while it is yet night, considers a field, buys it, gets herself with strength, strengthens her arms. Her lamp does not go out by night. So if somebody's lamp goes out by night, rises late, doesn't bring food from afar, doesn't willingly work, that person will not become a virtuous wife. Does it mean that God did not give her any gift? She probably has grace, but no virtue. So the virtue, therefore, did not come because of the gift God gave her. The virtue came because of the works she did. That is what made her a virtuous person. Are you following me? Now, I'm dealing with a virtuous wife, but we'll bring it home very soon. Because we need to get the fundamental principles right. The basis on which we achieve the things we achieve in life. The success of the virtuous wife is therefore based on her virtuous works. Her virtuous works. So let me ask you a question. If this virtuous wife, whom we have just talked about, and we have tried to decipher where her virtue came from her works. If this virtuous wife, a woman comes to her from CCC, or maybe not from CCC, and he says, Mrs. Virtuous, I want to be virtuous like you. Lay hands on me and pray for me that the grace that is upon your life as a virtuous woman will be imparted to me. Would that recipient become virtuous? We're getting somewhere. We're getting somewhere. Now, if she became virtuous by prayer, then she can impart her virtue by prayer. Is that not so? If she became virtuous by prayer, then she can lay hands on people and say, receive it, virtue. And they'll be virtuous wives.